Hey there. Before we start this episode, I wanted to jump into your ears straight away and let you know how you can support us best with this podcast so we can keep this going. So the most important thing that when you have listened to this episode would be share. Spread the word, drop our name, drop us in the conversation. If you see a question popping up somewhere, say, the Damn Parenting Ladies, they have an episode on this. Pop the episodes out. Get us into the conversation of the communities. This is the best way to support Eva and me. And give us a like on Spotify. Give us a follow. Jump over to Instagram, Damn Parenting Podcast. Make sure that you spread the word about what you like, why you like the episodes, and that you spread the knowledge that we are putting out there so it can be heard and received by everyone who needs to hear this. And this is what I just wanted to drop with you before now you can enjoy them pet or an expert episode. So let's see what's going to be on.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Damn Parenting, your English-speaking parenting podcast from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. As always, we are your hosts, Eva and
Maren.
And today we are joined by Isabella Cruz. Hello, Isabel.
Hi, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. Isabel runs Kaleidoscope Consulting, and she is very busy actually lately because actually she's supplying more and more workshops. But one of the workshops she's actually going to be joining us to talk about today is how to talk about race with kids. This is a workshop she previously was providing, but this is quite a touchy subject. Let's be real. I mean, who wants to turn up to a course to be talked? How are you going to talk about race to your kids? Like, the reality is we feel awkward enough about the sex topic, but then there's also these other elements that we are going to have to broach as parents. And it can be awkward to say, I need help with this, when the reality is we do. None of us are going to be able to say, hey, I know how this other person feels, so I'll be able to explain that to you. So Isabel has graciously joined us, and she's actually going to be providing all her knowledge and insight and research. And hopefully this is going to provide a space for our listeners to be able to sit down and listen and learn. And hopefully you'll be able to feel more confident moving forward then with your children on this, well, very important topic in modern world, never mind the 20th century, but moving forward. And especially if you're in the Netherlands, like in Amsterdam, where it's broadcasted all the time. There's 180 nationalities here. So, I mean, what better topic to do than with Isabel to be able to talk about this? Why don't we get started? What is race in the first place?
Yeah.
How can you define it?
That's a great question to start with. And I just wanted to first, thank you for inviting me back. I'm happy to be talking about this really important topic. And just for people who don't know my background, I am an educator and also a consultant, and I do work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also just around education in general. So this is a topic, that's important to me and I think should be important to everyone. But okay, what is race? So first of all, I think it's important that we are all on the same page that it's a social construct. It's not a real thing. Skin color, of course, is real, but race is something that was invented by people. And if we go back in time in history, it really became, I guess, a concept around the time of slavery, because the people who were enslaving had to find a way to justify enslaving humans. And so they created this sort of hierarchy of people with the lightest skin, being the most superior, the people with the darkest skin, being seen as, I guess you could say inferior. And so it's not something that's real, but it's something that has become very real over time and something that we see real world implications on all the time. Yeah, even though it's not real, it's very real.
The effects, I guess, discrimination, racism, all the things that people are confronted with. And I think it is so important, especially for us, or I'm speaking for myself, someone who has not faced racial discrimination. I still want to be aware of this because I might not be aware of some things that I just don't know because I have never experienced them, but they are very, very real for someone else. So I think this is such an important topic that I think we have to educate ourselves, and especially if we're not affected by it, so we can see the reality for a lot of people. And also, I mean, we're tapping into a very sensitive topic also with everything that's going on with the elections all around the world, where I think especially people who say, oh, well, but it's not my problem. Like, I'm not going to feel any effect of this, but your neighbor might be, your kids' friends at school might be affected by this. I mean, we've heard so many stories how politics change the life of people, like the daily life. So I think it's very, very important that we be aware of this and know how to navigate this topic.
Yeah, and there's also the fact of the big P word, as it were, which is privilege. I mean, this has kind of really come out only, I think, in the last 20 years, where people are actually acknowledging the fact that we don't have to go through certain thoughts other people do. Like, am I safe? Am I okay? Am I going to be accepted? There's a lot of these kind of things that are out there. So that's the reason why this episode we felt would be an amazing addition to the podcast, so that people can really sit down and absorb this and listen to it, because we never know what our future is going to hold. But if we can basically give our children that understanding and the power and knowledge and confidence to move forward, that's obviously we're doing a good job then.
Yeah, and I think what you said about privilege is important too, because choosing not to talk about race or not having to talk about race is definitely a privilege. Because there are families that don't have that privilege, that must talk to their children before they go to school about race, what they might experience and the harm that they might endure from the things that people say or the way they're treated. So that is a privilege not to have to talk about it. So it's something, there's this quote that I really like. It's this woman, Liz Kleinrock. She's an educator and a anti-bias, anti-racist educator. And she has this quote: "We can't change the things we don't talk about." So yeah, if we're not talking about it, nothing will change. So it's good that we're having this conversation.
Okay, well, why don't we start debunking some of the myths about talking to children about race?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And part of the reason why I started doing these workshops is because when I moved to Amsterdam and moved here about, I think it's almost been 7 years now, I noticed, especially in some of the parent groups that I joined on Facebook, et cetera, that anytime the topic of race would come out in a situation, maybe a parent was saying, my child experienced this, for example, the parent was saying, my child was being made fun of because of their skin color. I don't know how to handle this. And then some parents would respond and say, well, children don't see race, children don't see color. So that's the first myth I want to debunk, is that children are not colorblind. They definitely see color. And any parent of a young child will tell you that, when you're walking down the street with your kid, they are noticing physical differences. They are noticing, if somebody's really tall, if somebody's walking with a cane, if somebody's, has a wheelchair, all of these differences that they're noticing. And that's totally normal. They're also noticing differences in skin color. And so, children are hardwired to notice differences, and they're naturally curious about those differences because they're trying to understand the patterns, the rules in the world, and where they fit in. So if something's a little bit different from their family, it's going to get their attention. And it's important that we acknowledge that and talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's actually, I have this thing at the moment with, someone with a wheelchair at our Albert Heijn, and our daughter is like, why? And there's all these questions that start coming up. And I'm like, if I don't talk about it, then I'm ignoring it. And then I have to then sit down. Sometimes I've gone to the library to get a book about it, just to be kind of just talking about it. And then some of the books actually you have that you highlight, it shows all the differences of people in those books, in the school books, especially, like to showcase what's available.
I think one important point also is that I have realized is that what you said, children notice the difference, but they don't judge it. Mm-hmm. And that's the most important thing. Like they see, okay, someone is different, but they don't come to the conclusion and I'm better or they're like worse or whatever. They just notice, they're curious. And I think this is where we can then tap into this curiosity and make, okay, let's explore and let's educate and let's talk. And so I think this is then the biggest misconception that we as adults have, where we do mostly draw conclusions or judge or whatever, that they just see, they notice, they verbalize that. And then it's with us, what do we do with this information now? What do we do with this curiosity then?
Yeah, well, that actually leads me to thinking about how children's racial identities and their racial attitudes develop. And so I think it's interesting to see that we can talk about that timeline and how it evolves over time. So, for example, they've done research that shows that even babies can differentiate between race. They did this study where I think the babies were around 6 or 8 months old, and they showed them pictures of adults that were strangers that were the same race as their parents. And then they showed them pictures that were strangers of a different race. And then they tracked their eyes and they tried to see how long they looked at each picture to see if it was different with the different races. And what they found was that the babies looked longer at the pictures that were the same race as their parents. And these were all kids of one race, not multiracial families. And so, so then they could see that already at a young age, at babies, at the age of, 6 months, less than a year, that they were already differentiating. And, there's different theories about why that might be. It might be like a survival instinct, where they are looking for the person who looks like their parent to get, that food and love and security and all of that. But yeah, so I think anyone who says, again, you can even use that as your rebuttal if somebody says children are colorblind, and you could say, well, even babies can differentiate and notice the differences. But then when children become 3, they start to notice and make those comments about racial differences, like, why is that man's skin dark? Or why is your skin is the same color as mine. So they're just, again, like you said, Maren, noticing those differences. Yeah, and as adults, we can be affirming that. But then when kids get to be about 4 and 5, and this is the age when they typically will start school, they already start to show signs of racial bias already at that age. And we can talk about this more later, but they're getting, all these racialized messages from the world around them. And so they're already internalizing that. And something that, if people want to dive a little deeper, one thing I could recommend is to watch. There's been this experiment called the doll test. I don't know if you've heard of it, where I think it was like in the 80s, maybe. They took kids who were around age 4 and 5 and showed them dolls that were white and that were black. And then they said, point to the doll that you want to play with, or point to the doll that's naughty, or point to the doll that's pretty. And what they found was that children, white, black, brown, everybody favored the white doll and internalized all these positive attributes to the white doll and all these negative attributes to the black doll. And it was really, it's really heartbreaking to watch. But I think it's, again, showing that even young children, because of all the, overt, covert messages that they're getting, have already internalized this racism. And so, so it's important, again, to be having these conversations so we can dismantle that, because otherwise, if we don't talk about it, then, these attitudes will, of course, perpetuate.
This is also very powerful for us parents, how much power we have in this, and how much of a saying we do have in this, and how much of a saying we have to have in this, so we don't ignore this topic out of fear, because they will be socialized, and we want them to be socialized in the way that we see the world, and we want them to be growing up empathetic, inclusive humans. So we cannot not have this conversation, because they will be socialized in school, social media, wherever it is a topic in the rest of the world. And even if we as parents choose to not address it and be like, oh, it's going to be fine. And if we don't say anything, then we might risk that they pick up the wrong things. So I think it's very powerful that we have to see what an impact we have to have and can have in that education.
Yeah, like being really intentional, definitely.
Can you share any common myths that we can just debunk straight away?
Yeah, so definitely that children are not colorblind. And another one would be about representation. So how do I explain this one? So sometimes families have this idea that children are, quote, racist because their parents are sharing racist ideas. But really, it's more about the lack of exposure, right? So I tell this story in my workshop about when I was teaching. I used to teach in New York City, and the last school I worked at before I moved here, I was teaching what would be the equivalent of group 1, like a pre-K class. And my students were around 4 years old. And we were outside at recess one day, and this was like the beginning of the school year. And one of my students comes running up to me, and she said, "Those girls won't let me play with them." And I was like, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, they said I can't play with them because I'm brown." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, they're 4, they're already, oh my goodness." So it was I was a little bit shocked. And so, and I don't know if I had said this before, but the school was very diverse and very, I guess you could say, quote, progressive. Parents intentionally chose this school because it was so multicultural. But then, so then I spoke to the other girls, and they were all white. And I asked them, Bianca said you wouldn't let her play with you because she's brown. Can you tell me what did you mean by that? Or I tried to act, very neutral and not judging and just trying to get more information. And so when I asked them that, they said, well, we were playing princess and there are no brown princesses.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
Mm-hmm. So in their 4-year-old mind, they'd never seen a brown princess. So it didn't make sense. So they just, were like, sorry, you can't play because it doesn't make sense. So I think it was a good reminder for me as a teacher and for the parents in the class that we needed to be even more intentional about exposing them, to Black and brown and Asian and everything, all these different princesses or in any form, not just princesses, because if they don't see it, they don't believe it. So it was, so I think that's another myth that none of these parents in that class, I mean, I knew the parents and I knew, their, like that I could not imagine them being at home teaching their children to be racially discriminating. That wasn't their personality as far as I knew, but no, but honestly, so I think it's just a reminder that we have to be really intentional about the work and not just assume because we're, quote, good people that they're going to be fine. No, we have to be being intentional.
I mean, that really kind of speaks to the movies that we've noticed in the last, I think even just 20 years is like, as you say, like The Little Mermaid was white, Snow White, like every Snow White, I mean, you know, perfect description of it. Everything always was white. Barbie as well. But I mean, Barbie became a little bit more progressive with the workings of people who are actually in the company itself, who actually were fortunately able to make a movement on that. But indeed, everything that we see, and as we always say, like the books are like the windows as well, like into the world where we're able to actually showcase in that way. So yeah, I do think in modern day right now, we have a lot more options. So it's just a case of making those choices of, I guess trying to figure out which one is the most acceptable way. Personally,
and also normalizing it, you know, and not making it a big deal. Like the last Ariel, she was a person of color, but it wasn't, it's a person like, this is Ariel and this is the actor and this is how she looks now. And then that's it. And not make it a big deal why we do this, but it's representation, and you can't be what you can't see. I mean, this is like a broken record kind of saying. It is true. And this is true for not only race, but also for disabilities, different body types, all these different things, women,
gender,
in language. Like, how do we include everyone into the conversation? We tend to forget this in our bubbles, but also when we're in our bubbles and we think we're so woke, and then it's like we step out of it and think, oh yeah, actually there's still a lot of education to do around this topic.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, personally, it's just one of those things that these things are reminders, like, that we need to make these efforts as parents to be able to say, like, you know, your dolls are not just all white dolls just because that's what's available, but to go out and seek to show that there is no difference, because at the end of the day, we're the ones who make a big deal out of, we have a black Barbie, we have a brown Ariel, we have Monana, like, we're showcasing. That's the parents, that's the adults who are doing this marketing, as it were, of we are good people and we are doing our best. And it's a case of, it doesn't need to be a big showcase and parade. It's just need to be, let's be subtle. They're not going to notice a difference. You know, they're just going to be like, oh, this is in my world, you know, and that's it.
Yeah. But I think it is important. Yeah. And that's something, actually, there's been research done. It's this Dutch professor at Leiden, I think Judy Messman, I think her name is. And she's done a lot of research on how children develop racist ideas or racist attitudes. And she did this experiment with Dutch families. I think they were white Dutch families, where one group of parents, both groups of parents were given books with very diverse, racially diverse characters. But one group was told, don't talk about the racial differences, just read the book. And the other group was told, do talk about the racial differences. And so then they followed up with those families a couple years later, and then they found out that the families that didn't talk about the racial differences, those children had more racist ideas, and the group that did talk about the racial differences had less. And so I think that shows that you should be talking about it and normalizing it, though, like, and making it natural. Like, oh, look, isn't that cool that we all have different color skin? How boring would that be if everybody looked the same? And, oh, you can talk about hair, whatever the differences are, but just to point that out and normalize it. Because I think if we just, we have to be deliberate and intentional.
Do children at different ages, so if someone's listening to this, if they have a child who's maybe 3 versus 5, 7, 9, even 12, I guess, are they developing, or are their attitudes, I guess, changing to race then at that stage?
Yeah, they're always sort of evolving over time. And so I think it's around, like I was saying, around 4 or 5 where they start to express racial bias. And then when kids are around 9 or 10, their attitudes become a little bit more solidified. So if there haven't been those conversations, or there haven't been significant life experiences or something to give them that grounding, then they will probably have more bias, and it's harder to course correct. So because children by the age of 9 or 10, they have more of a fixed mindset. And so young children, this is why these conversations are important to start early, because young children are very flexible thinkers and open-minded. And as children become older, it's hard to change those habits. So that's another, for those of people listening who have, like, even babies, you can start the conversation, just if you're not comfortable with it, just to be practicing, right? And then, definitely the sooner you start, the easier it will be.
Okay. Where are kids actually getting then messages then about race and racism? Because in my head, I believe it's a case of it's your parents, the modeling that your parents do, I guess, and it's the ignoring whatever it is. So what would you put to that?
Yeah, so there's this quote that I really like by this American scholar, Beverly Tatum, and she said something like, racism is everywhere. It's like the smog in the air. It's something that you're always breathing in, and sometimes it's really visible and obvious, and other times it's less visible, but it's always there. I feel like I totally butchered the quote, but hopefully you get the idea. Like, yeah, it's something that we're living with, right? It's everywhere, but sometimes it's more obvious. And so some of the ways that kids getting these messages, like you mentioned earlier, it's through the shows that they watch, the videos, social media, like when they're watching these programs, who is considered the beautiful one, right? And who's considered the villain. So those sort of stereotypes start to even mold that way, or through the books. They're hearing things from their peers, getting messages even at school. So for example, I used to work at this school where it's a private school where the teaching staff was like, I don't know, like 95% white, and the cleaning staff was like 95% people of color. And there was one Black teacher who said she was always being mistaken for the cleaning staff. And people would come up to her and say, there was a spill over in the bathroom. Can you clean it up? And because people just unconsciously saw her, because there was such lack of representation, so they just made that conclusion. So then kids are picking that message up, not that they're trying to be intentionally racist, but that's just the messages that they're picking up. You get messages through the community, who do you see who's working the community jobs, like picking up the garbage, or who do you see in the doctor's office? Is it, for example, all white men? Do you have a female doctor? Do you have a person of color? Yeah, I don't think those are subconscious, or not subconscious, but those are indirect messages that kids are getting about who has value and who has status, I guess. And then they're getting messages through their neighborhood. Like, especially you can see this in America, where the neighborhoods, there's a lot of extremes. Like if you're in a wealthy neighborhood, it's unfortunately usually predominantly white. And then if you're in a high poverty neighborhood, it's usually predominantly people of color. And so kids start to see those, assign value to that, even though, of course, it's deeper, systemic problems, and especially in the US, but they're getting messages from that. Or like in a museum, whose art is on the wall, whose art is getting celebrated, who's missing, so who gets to be an artist and whose art gets to be celebrated. So they're getting these, the messages are everywhere. And sometimes we're not even conscious of the messages that they're getting, because it's just so, I think it's all so systemic and embedded in society everywhere.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't have actually even picked up on the art, whose art is shown, because half the time is like, I don't even know the person whose art it is that I'm looking at. So I'm like,
well, you can always assume, take a wild guess, it's probably going to be a white male. So yeah.
Or sometimes just the subject matter. Is it all, very Eurocentric, like living in Europe? I guess that is often the case. But
can you give us any tips on how we can then talk to our children, be it the toddlers, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, or even the 6, 7-year-olds?
Yeah. So in general, I think just as a guiding principle, I think it's good to, like we've been saying, and I think I'm just going to keep repeating this, affirm racial differences whenever you have the opportunity, if it's in a book or, in whatever context you're in, it's always good to be affirming that, and being a role model, of course, for empathy and inclusivity. These are all just sort of general tips, and I can get into some more specific ones. And also just to be always, if your child says something that is like a stereotype or misinformation, it's always important to correct it and not ignore it, because when we ignore, then we're being complicit, right? And letting that misinformation continue and giving that child the message that what they said was okay. So we need to correct. And then, but then for more specific tips, I would say, when children are asking questions about racial differences, affirm their questions and try to ask open-ended questions to find out what they already know, like things like, tell me more, or what makes you say that? Or, and then you want to find out, like, if there's gaps, or if they're confused about something, or if they're hearing stereotypes that need to be corrected. And then sometimes we'll have situations where, like, a kid will ask us something that we don't know the answer to, and that's an opportunity. So if a child asks you a question and you're not sure how to answer it, you can say, like, that's a great question. Let's find out together. Or, like, I'm not sure, but, I'm going to find out and get back to you. And just also be modeling that we, even as adults, we don't have all the answers, and that's okay, because we're always learning. And I think as a teacher, that's something that I think is really important for kids to see, that we never stop learning. And I can give an example. Like when at my daughter's school, there's I'm not sure what percentage of the families are Muslim, but I would say maybe like 15-20% of the families are Muslim. And one day she asked me, why do some of the mothers cover their hair? They wear, I think she called it like a scarf or something over their hair. And so I said, it's because their religion, they're Muslim. And I didn't really know, how to accurately describe, because I wasn't 100% sure why they cover their hair. And so I found a children's book that we could read together, and it was very affirming. And so I thought that was something I would advise other parents to do. If you don't know the answer, thankfully we live in 2024 when there's so many beautiful children's books out, and you can probably find a book that could help you explain something that you might not know the answer to.
What I also find very, very important is also educating the rest of your family about this, especially when you talk about the older generations, about what words do we not use anymore, and what phrases do we, what's the language that we want to use, and also be very firm with that. Don't shy away from the confrontation, because if you let it slip, then what is the child gonna hear? Like they're still gonna hear this reproduced bullshit. I'm just going to call it bluntly. And then they're going to get confused. So is it okay? And like, but Oma says it and Mama says no. And then they're getting into this conflict. So it's like really important that within the family, you're on the same page, but also as the parents, you know that at the end of the day, you are responsible for that child, and you need to make that clear to the rest of the family, and also maybe explain to the child, well, this person chooses to do this, but it's important for us and our family that we don't do this and we don't say this. So if you hear this, know that this is not how we speak. If we can't change the other person, if there's so much resistance and so much, I need to say this word in order to survive. Yeah, because that's also an important topic, I feel.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example, what you just said about being a role model for your children. Maybe it's not in that situation a popular opinion in that context, but it's important that you're standing up for what's right, and your child is seeing that and saying like, oh, okay, I admire my mom, or whatever. So that's great.
And if we talk about a bit older children, so if we talk about 9, 10, 11, 12.
Well, something that you can even start younger, but I think at any age they're interested in this, is to think about why we have skin color, or how we get our skin color. And that's a conversation. Yeah, I've had this conversation in the classroom with kids who were, 10, 11, or with kids who are 6 and 7, but to talk about melanin and how we all have melanin in our bodies. And it's, some people have a lot of melanin because a long time ago, their ancestors came from a part of the world where they needed a lot of protection from the sun because they came from climates where there was a lot of sun, or people have less melanin because their ancestors came from a part of the world where they didn't need as much because there was less sun. And then with older kids, it can be fun to look at a map and see how, like when you look at the map, you can see people along the equator. There's actually maps that have been created that show, skin colors and which part of the world they come from. And you can see it's all concentrated around the equator, where people with the darkest skin are usually around the equator because that's where there's the most intense sun. And so I think that could be an interesting, it can lead to a lot of interesting conversations. And it also just gets to the science of why we have skin color. And it's not something that's subjective. It's, biological, scientific. And so that really helps to, I guess, another way to normalize it, right?
Yeah, very true. It's actually, it brings up quite a lot of then what's going on in school as well. Because school could then also be a part of this to actually highlight that as well.
Yeah, I think it should. Yeah, just like you said in the beginning, we talk about sex education, and this is something, we also could be normalizing in schools. And some schools are beginning to have those conversations in different ways, but I think every school should, because racism, it's happening everywhere. It's not something that is just happening. And it happens in overt ways and covert ways in schools. So sometimes the teachers don't even know it's happening, but
so something you were saying there was about correcting a child. So Maren was giving her example, and we were talking about correcting something that might have happened. How are we meant to subtly go about correcting something like if there's an assumption like you gave about in the school where there's 95% white teachers versus the cleaning staff, for example? How would we go about correcting that? Like, what is something we should be saying about that?
Yeah, I think kids also need real life exposure to something that confronts that and disproves that. So, but if kids are only being exposed to only seeing, people of color in these subservient roles, that's really hard to have a conversation and say, there's, whatever. But so I think kids need to have real world examples. I think that's, if your child is living in that sort of environment where they're not getting exposed to diversity in more affirming roles, or not, I shouldn't say affirming, but in a more diversity of roles, then I think that's up to the parent to try to find those sources. So maybe find communities of color where you can, or communities of, like, for example, I know there's events at the World Museum. It used to be the Tropen Museum, like seeking out events where your child will be exposed to more diversity, or I'm trying to think what else. That's the first example that comes to my mind, but being deliberate about it. Or maybe, thinking about your own friend group, like who is my child being exposed to? Or are they only being exposed to people who are the same race as me? Or as my family, because they also need, as adults, it starts with us, right? If we're role modeling that all our friends look the same and whatever, then it also is sending a message to children. So it starts with our real world actions.
Another thing you mentioned there was if they're asking questions and it's a case of, hey, why don't we look this up together? So this is something I'm 100% enthusiastic about, is the bibliotherapy, where we use books to actually showcase things. But when something happens, say a Tuesday, and they're kind of like, oh, so this happens. But the thing is, I can't get to that library until Saturday or Sunday. Is it a case of I have to keep reminding them to say, hey, you brought this up, we're going to go to the library to investigate it? Or is it something that I can wait until the Saturday? It's not in my child's head at all. And then I come back to her to say, I'm restarting this conversation to say, hey, and we're going to go to the library to look up that thing that we discussed back on Tuesday.
Yeah, I think in a child's world, it's all fine, right? Yeah, and I think it's something you can I think it's fine. Yeah, it's something you can have little small conversations about until Saturday, when you have that more thorough conversation with the books, but it's something you could be bringing up in small doses too along the way. But also it's fine if you can't, if it's a few days later. Remember when you said, I wanted to go to the library and find a book so we could learn about that more.
So when you're speaking earlier about when we were talking about showcasing and going to the library and all those kind of examples, how can we teach the children? Because as adults, we are meant to understand that people have different backgrounds and that they're going to have a different perspective. How are we meant to also give that to our children, for our children to understand, well, they don't watch the same TV shows as us or whatever. Like, don't assume these people know exactly what you have, because they don't.
I think for me, maybe this is not answering your question, but this is how I'm going to approach it. What I would recommend is just that every family focus on building a positive foundation of their own racial identity and a positive foundation of, other cultural and racial identities. And I think if you do that, you start with the positive, exposing your child in real world ways, and through books, through movies, through even like the restaurants you go to. Like, the more exposure your child has to the rich diversity of the world, the more solid foundation they'll have, and they can take that with them into the world. So I guess I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but I think that maybe not.
I guess it comes back to, when I was listening to this, it just comes back to awareness of privilege also, of the whole thing. Like, I don't see color. Like, yeah, great. I'm happy for you that you can afford to not see that, because it's not a problem in your world. Or when we come to the whole blackfacing issue, which is sadly still a topic here in the Netherlands, or in other countries as well, where, I can choose then to wash this off, and then I go back into my white privileged world and I don't have to deal with this. And it's fun for me, and it's a costume. And I guess making children aware of that this is not why we don't do this, and why this is hurtful to other people, and just, making them sensitive towards this, that they can also then speak up if they see this happening with their friends, with their peers, when they're, I guess it's then probably for older kids also, when they start to reproduce this stuff. Maybe I assume not being mean or not being intentionally wanting to hurt someone, but just because they have seen it, they've consumed this somewhere. So our children also can point this out. Like, hey, this is why are you doing this? Or is there a reason? Or let's not do this. This is hurtful to person X, or hurtful to me, or whatever. Like, just giving our children the tools then also to communicate this.
Okay. Yeah. So I hear what you're saying. And I think what I'm getting is that we want to find ways to empower our kids, right? To speak up if they see unfairness or if they see injustice. And so, what I think is there's many different ways to go about that. Of course, one idea is through books, of course, because there are so many great books. And one book I really like for that is I Walk with Vanessa. And the author, I cannot pronounce their name, so I will not try, but it's a wordless book. And it's a nice story to share with kids, to talk about what they see in the pictures, what's happening in the story. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but for listeners who might not know it, it's basically a story about a girl who's getting bullied at school. And then another child witnesses it, and then is really troubled by what she witnessed. And you also see the girl who was bullied that night, and how they're both really sad. And so then the next morning, the girl who witnessed it gets together with her friends, and all of a sudden they find the girl on the way to school, and they all protect her, basically. Yeah, they support her. And so it's a story of children seeing that an injustice happened, and then coming together collectively to support that person who was harmed. And it's a really empowering story for kids. And there's other stories like that, where I think for kids, they really need to see those real examples of kids standing up and doing the right thing and speaking up when they see an injustice, because they need to feel that agency and that hope. And sometimes when we talk about all these, terrible things that have happened or that are currently happening, it can be kind of depressing for kids. So we want to make sure that they also have a balance of stories that make them feel like, I can speak up. I'm empowered. So that's, a good, thanks for reminding me about that.
Speaking of books, then, can you share with us some of your favorite children's books? so that we can have help with the conversations?
Yeah, so I'll try to limit it because I think there's so many that I really like. But yeah, definitely I Walk with Vanessa is a great one for younger children, probably up until maybe even 6 or 7. I really like, oh yeah, and just before I get into other books, I think you just mentioned that books can be mirrors. And I think that's something also just to highlight for the listeners, that books can be mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors. So the idea that children need books where they see their own identities and experiences reflected, and they need books where they have windows into people's worlds that are different from their own. And so, yeah, to build empathy and understanding. And then there's also this idea of sliding glass doors where kids see worlds where it's people who are different from them, but yet their identity, their race or culture is not the central theme of the story. It's not about them being, an Indian child. It's more about, they're going to the grocery store and going to make a birthday cake or something. So it's just normalizing that, it's not so much about their identity that way. And so some books that I really like, I also like Anti-Racist Baby. I think that's a really good book because the book gives some empowering language about talking about race. And also the pictures, I think, are really a good starting point for conversations. You can ask the child, what did they notice in the pictures? I also really like there's a book series called First Conversations. And so there's a book called Our Skin. And then there's also ones about body and gender and other topics. But the one, Our Skin, does a really great job of breaking it down and how to have conversations about what do you notice about your skin? And, oh, we have melanin. And that sort of talks about the origin of race and all of this in child appropriate language or age appropriate language. And some of these books, maybe depending on your children, you might need to paraphrase and use your own words if it feels like it's, not quite where they're at yet. What other books do I like? I really like the book for babies. I really like Global Babies. It's a book that just features images of babies from around the world. And it's just a nice way to start those conversations when they're really little. And actually, my daughter, we had that book when she was a baby and she kept reading it enjoying it until I want to say 4 or 5, because the pictures are really colorful. There are all these beautiful babies and you can have conversations about, what do you notice? Oh, look, this baby is brown skin like you or whatever. Isn't that cool that we have people are so different everywhere in the world? And how boring would it be if we all look the same? I also really like the author, I'm going to probably say it wrong, Ogemura. She's written this book that is a favorite in our house, Saturday. And it's about a Black mother and a Black child and just their Saturday and what they do. They have this routine every Saturday. The things that they do, they get their hair done, and that day they were going to go see a theater show, and things went wrong. And it also gives you just real life. It just normalizes. Yeah, look at this family; they're like us too. So I think that's a nice example of a sliding glass door. Yeah, there's so many books, but I can. Yeah, if you want a couple more titles, I'm happy to
we'll put them all in the show notes then so that everyone will be able to click on them. Some of those books are available in Obeah. I think I have most of the ones you've already mentioned, but some of them will be in Obeah, thankfully. But for the rest of them, we'll be able to send them a link and also where they'll be able to get them from as well. What other advice would you like to share with the parents that you can think of?
Yeah, I feel like we've already covered so much, but let's see. Yeah, you mentioned about toys and thinking about, the representation in your toys and your dolls, even in the games that you have, like board games and card games. And also, crayons, markers, like having skin color crayons. So then that also is another way to amplify how we do have different skin colors, and children can more accurately depict the people in their lives, right? When they have more skin color crayons. And I don't know if it's the same with you, but when I was a child, we only had, there was the one crayon that was sort of this pale, it's supposed to be, I guess, a white skin tone, and it was called flesh, but not everybody has that. That's not everybody's flesh color, right? So at least now we have, a lot more options. Let's see, other advice. I think it's also starting with ourselves, like examining what we're modeling to our children. Like, how diverse is our friend group? How diverse is our neighborhood? And how diverse if you think about a typical day, how much diversity is your child exposed to? And in what way is the diversity? What messages are they getting from that diversity that they see? Is it reinforcing stereotypes? Is it not? Is it confronting stereotypes?
I'm just going to say something. I like this. I don't know if anyone else has got this coming into their mind, but the thing is, when we talk about this, we want to do our best and we want to be the best parents we can be or whatever. We also don't want to be fake to forge a relationship with someone from a different culture or move house to a different thing. So the thing is, we don't want to be feeling like we're faking it because, this is the best thing to do. So we have to make this, and we have to now seek out people that we can find who are of different race or different culture. So how could we kind of be a bit more calming in that kind of aspect of saying, socializing in a community center or socializing in certain events? That's more of exposure that way, because you can't force friendships, as it were, as adults.
Yeah, I think it's about accepting that maybe it will be awkward sometimes. And I think sometimes people get stuck because they don't want to be uncomfortable. But I think, maybe it will be uncomfortable and you got to push through that, because the alternative is then nothing changes, right? So, but put yourself in situations, for example, instead of going to the pool in your neighborhood, go to a pool in a different neighborhood where there are kids from, a different background from your own, or go to, if you're religious, go to a service at a church that's, has different cultural diversity than your family, or put yourself in other neighborhoods. And it doesn't have to be like you transport your house into a different neighborhood, but you can still, those neighborhoods are still accessible to all of us. So find ways to, or shop, in different neighborhoods. Like there's, for example, bookstores all over the city. So go to a bookstore that's in a different neighborhood that maybe has a different cultural diversity than your neighborhood. Restaurants, I think I mentioned that earlier. And there's different cultural events always happening here that you can tap into. So
speaking of which, this is actually going to be going out just before Keti Koti. So is there anything you'd like to share with us that way? Or is there something you'd like to speak about that so that we can have the weekend ahead of us and we can plan something?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a beautiful festival where, for people who don't know, Keti Koti is the holiday. Well, I guess it's not an official holiday, which would be nice. And I think they're pushing for that to make it an official holiday, but that hasn't happened yet. But it's the acknowledgement of the abolition of slavery in Suriname. So it's a combination of reflecting, I think Keti Koti literally means breaking free of chains, something like that. And so in Amsterdam, they have a big celebration, the Museumplein. We went last year. It was really fun. Amazing food. That was for sure a highlight, because I'm always seeking out delicious food in this country. And there was amazing music. And there were kids' activities. I think there was a puppet show, which we missed. But and it's just a really great atmosphere. And so if you are available, I think it's July 1st, if you're available. And then if you're not in Amsterdam, this event or this celebration or this commemoration is happening in other cities too. So you can Google Keti Koti in your city and see if there's something nearby.
I think we actually did something 2 years ago in Oosterpark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
The Tropen Museum also had involvement because it's of a cultural aspect.
And if there's nothing around, then this is your call to initiate something in your neighborhood and get your friends together, or initiate something at the daycare, at the school, whatever. Like, we can also be the people who put these things in place and make them visible. And I think this is always a good reminder of also, we cannot always rely on the people who are affected by this topic to educate us and to provide all these opportunities for us. But we, as people who are in a different position, have to go out and we have to make the effort, and we have to make sure that we don't just rely on, someone will come and educate us or someone will provide this for us. But we can also go and include the other person, be like, hey, I saw you're coming from this cultural background. Can I ask you for a recipe? Or can I include them and make them seen and feel like I care about your culture, I care about your background, and I want to be the person who reaches out to you, and I'm coming to you, and you don't have to do the work because it's on me to educate myself about that.
Yeah, I think that's what you were saying too, about inviting or encouraging childcare centers and schools to acknowledge the holiday, because that's something that my daughter's school does. And I really appreciate that, because for me, when I moved here, I did not know about the history. I did not know about this holiday. I keep calling it a holiday. I'm not sure if that's the right word, and I'm really grateful that they do. And that's something that they do every year, where they invite people from Surinamese background to come into the school. They talk about the history. They do dances. They do this dance activity with the children. And it's really special. And I have some food as well. So it's like a nice cultural celebration as well. And every school could be doing this.
Indeed, every space that there is available. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us. Isabel Cruz does run workshops. She's got a couple of school ones now running at the moment, but How to Speak to Our Children About Race is a workshop that obviously is just not really a topic that we kind of feel comfortable, as we mentioned at the start of this. It's a topic we need to address. And this is the episode that we really wanted to get out. And we are so grateful for you for joining us, because this has actually been months in the organization of trying to make sure that we got this out, and also at an appropriate time. And so we wanted to make sure this got out at the end of June. So we thank you for joining us. Isabel is available as well as a consult. She's a consultant that you can actually hire to bring in. So she'll be able to have these conversations with the teachers so that they can actually be supported. At the end of the day, it's about reminders, and it's about support, and it's about surrounding yourself with the people who will be able to help you get to where you want to go. And as parents, we need every single ounce of help possible. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I just want to say one little thing that I meant to mention earlier, is that sometimes we're afraid to have these conversations. We're afraid to make mistakes. And I think we all need to let that go. There's no such thing as being perfect about, well, that's a thing, I think a theme in parenting in general is to get over perfection, but especially when it comes to this, we will make mistakes and we learn from the mistakes and we do better the next time. So yeah, don't let that stop you from having these important conversations.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And if you want to hear more from our experts, every Wednesday we come out with an expert episode on this podcast. Every Monday we are dropping the damn chats between Eva and I about the topic that we're just casually chatting about. You can catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on Instagram, Damn Parenting Podcast. And of course, we will put all of Isabel's information into the show notes, where to catch her, how to get in contact with her, all the great recommendations that she has mentioned throughout the episode about books and festivities about Kitty Kotti or other things where you can educate yourself about this topic. If you want to support us with the podcast, you can share and like this episode. You can give us a 5-star rating on your podcast player and spread the word about this important topic or about other episodes that you find relevant for you or your friends. And we will hear you on the next episode. Thank you so much.
Bye.